and our narratives of progress are built on the exclusion of disturbing others and the forgetting of disturbing attachments. Let's see if this works. Yay. Critics of conventional LGBT history writing, like David Halperin and Valerie Rohe, also attack the professional historian's caution about anachronism. Academic historians, in seeking to understand the past on its own terms, are trained to resist reading the past through the lenses of the present. In other words, we try to stay alert for what is strange, different, and unfamiliar in our documents. Trained to look for the unfamiliar and to valorize it over the familiar, historians can fail to recognize sisters and brothers in the queer past. By sticking to the rules of the proper professional historian, we thereby lose opportunities to identify with strange lovers in history. As David Halperin admitted, and I'm quoting here, identification with same-sex relations found in the past gets at something important. It picks out resemblances, connections, and echo effects, end quote. In other words, we want to feel our common queer humanity across time when we look at the past. Valerie Rohe goes even further by referring to psychoanalysis and its understanding of the evolution of the self. She reminds us that Freud sees the personality as constantly reconstructing the past and projecting falsifications on the genuine events of past life. The mind, in other words, works ahistorically. And here's a quote from her article. It should actually say ahistorical on the slide. That's a mistake in GOQ a few years back. So she says, because anachronism structures all psychic life, the ahistorical, like the propensity for homosexual attraction, is typical, not exceptional. Freud's understanding that the normal is pathological and that the pathological is normal may be his greatest and most humane insight. Everyone fails at development. Everyone is subject to sexual perversity. Everyone falls back in time. Under these circumstances, straight hegemony must represent anachronism as deviance in order to displace the burden of the ahistorical onto others. Queers and peoples of color, each differently stigmatized as primitive, and to claim for itself the role of truth, not falsification, the path of progress, not regression. For Rohe, we queers are all already ahistorical. We're already out of time because of our perversity, our failed development. And to resist straight time means we need to recognize and celebrate queer time. Queer time is a model of time that makes space for our existence. The critics who argue for thinking queerly about time point out that straight narratives regulate temporality to belittle or slow down queer progress, as in the phrase, gay is just a phase you're going through, or the phrase, your society is not ready for full LGBT rights, but will be after a long transition. Careful identification across time, strategic anachronism, enables us to challenge and offers the prospect of a richer understanding of the queer predicament in the straight world. A final set of critics of conventional history writing focus on what Duggan called the stunted archive of the queer past. In a world dominated by institutional heteronormativity, where archives are compiled and policed by the straight state, these critics ask how we could possibly fathom the experience of queer lives in the past if we only rely on the archive bequeathed to us by straight-thinking archivists and cultural gatekeepers. By sticking to convention, by respecting a politics of information curated against our interests, aren't we doomed to reproduce that homophobic perspective on our experience? As early as 1980, an American critic, Robert K. Martin, commenting on how American gay biography had been falsified and distorted thanks to the heteronormative forces in life writing, said this: "They have taken away our lives and we have paid for the loss." Anne Svetkovich surges ahead with her claims for an archive of feelings. In other words, we need to recognize how trauma has structured our lives and understand how speech about trauma fails to find its way, often, into the straight archive. And here is a short quote from her. "Trauma challenges common understandings of what constitutes an archive. Because trauma can be unspeakable and unrepresentable, and because it is marked by forgetting and dissociation, it often seems to leave behind no records at all. Trauma puts pressure on conventional forms of documentation, representation, and commemoration, giving rise to new genres of expression, such as testimony, and new forms of monuments, rituals, and performances that can call into being collective witnesses and publics." Successful memory work, in Svetkovich's view, should not restrict itself to the archive compiled by the straight state. We should be creating our own archives, based as much on emotion, sentiment, and feeling as on events, politics, or hard facts, to document our experience more richly. Popular documentation, artistic reconstruction, and fantasy all have a role in Svetkovich's vision of how to rethink queer history. So turning to think of history as a tool. Knowledge is not made for understanding, it's made for cutting. So wrote Michel Foucault. In fact, most historical research that is recognized today as cutting edge, as intellectually urgent, does not merely help us to understand, but it also assists us to cut through long accepted ideas, to cut through prejudice and conservatism to a better way of life. Contemporary historical practice is no longer merely factographic. It accepts very little as primordial, as unquestionably true, as uncontestable. The attentive historian combs through the archives, libraries, and interviews to accumulate evidence for a purpose, to analyze a question in its complexity, to trace the origins of a problem or issue, to deconstruct how a particular set of relations of power came to be. The contemporary historian strives to be self-aware, to reflect on what his subject position is, where his questions come from, why he is asking them. In the contemporary digital world, there's no mercy for the historian who pronounces ex cathedra as an infallible source of truth. I want to explore in this section how contemporary historical practices can assist queer movements in their activism. How can history answer the critics, and what can historical study contribute to queer politics? First, I'll discuss some of the questions that queer histories can explore, and argue that doing so is important for cementing queer solidarity and building queer communities. Second, I will answer some of the criticisms about conventional history with a few observations about the potential it offers for studying the queer past in the countries of the former Soviet Union. I began this lecture with a description of one of the major problems that queer youth often face. Most young people growing up in a straight family, in a heteronormative world, receive almost no information about queer life and queer possibilities. Instead, they encounter what Didier Eribon, the French scholar, calls insult, an onslaught of homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, and incomprehension if they express their queer desires. It takes very little conditioning in a child's life to produce what Valerie Traub and others have labeled gay shame. And there was a famous conference in the United States on gay shame almost 10 years ago now, and a collection of essays that came out, a very useful one, in 2009. Eribon calls insult the formative experience of the making of the gay self in our modern Western world. And I would say it also contributes, insult contributes to the making of queer selves in the non-West today. Insult, shame, and trauma are recurrent structures of a homophobic information regime. Few critics of queer existence have explicitly commented on what I'm about to note, but a highly damaging aspect of this situation is the rupture between generations that prevents the passage of information about queerness from one generation to the next, one cohort to the next. We live in a world where the transmission of information of queer knowledge to young people is still regarded with fear, hysteria, and political hostility. In such a world, it is fundamentally important to transmit queer knowledge to young people, to know that previous generations have confronted and coped with the dilemma of the queer self is a powerful knowledge to have. To know how previous generations of queers understood themselves is enriching and inspiring. It is part of that reconstruction of the personality that Rohi pinpoints. Healing the trauma of insult begins with understanding how others have managed that dilemma. As well, finding patterns and models for living a livable LGBT life is the start of a journey to self-realization that could take a young person in endless directions. Now note that I'm not saying that the patterns and models should be handed down rigidly on tablets of stone without questioning or criticism, with expectations that youngsters will still go to lesbian bars or keep using Grindr until the end of the 21st century. All I am saying is the fact of the existence in the world of ways of living a viable queer life should not be hidden from the young queer person embarking on their own path in life. So historical work, and perhaps particularly queer biography, can help the next queer generation to heal its traumas, address its questions about constructing viable selves, and rescue young people from isolation and pointless ignorance. In fact, stories about queer heroes are necessary to demonstrate that queer lives are livable lives, that trauma can be overcome, and that the wheel does not have to be reinvented in every generation. The Museum of LGBT History in Russia has a statement of values, and here they are on the screen. They recognize the importance of history for the next generation and to create tolerance and understanding in the world. Whatever the queer theory critics say about the tools of history, the tools of history actually still have a lot to contribute to the building of LGBT consciousness and community. So I'm going to turn to say a few words about the significance of conventional historical work and then tell you a little bit about some things I've observed in unconventional historical work. So the first thing to note about doing sort of proper history, if you like, is that it's not exhausted as a method in our region. There's still so much opportunity. There's so many documents and stories awaiting discovery. So I'm thinking about things like the diary of Karl Irba, an amazing Latvian source which runs from 1940 into the 1990s, into millions of words, which describes queer life in Riga and Soviet Latvia, well, in fact, through several regimes there. And there are many other examples from the Soviet world. It's really important to bring queer eyes into the archives. Many young students who I've talked to have told me about their supervisors from this region who have said, oh, don't bother going into the archives to look for queer material because you're not going to find it. And I actually strongly oppose that perspective and say we need to take our queer eyes, our queer understandings into the archives and begin to seriously look. The straight state's archives, in other words, are not so much stunted as misread, misunderstood, or just handled unprofessionally. Interviews offer a rich source of opportunity, and we're now at a time horizon that limits us to finding out about late Soviet queer existence, but it's still worth doing, and we have some really good examples in the work of Francesca Stella on late Soviet lesbians, and also the work of Rita Radusha on Latvian gay men and lesbians, both using interviews. And there are PhD students coming up as well, I've listed here on this slide, who are working with interviews to develop that as a source for queer history. Conventional historical work can be insurgent too. So what we do is take critical approaches to the archives of the straight state and develop our own alternative finding aids and our own alternative commentaries on the regime that we find in the archives. It's possible to do critical rereading of the existing material that we know about, and these are two examples here, by Vladimir Vlalodzin from Minsk and Ira Roldugina in Moscow, who have taken existing texts and are reworking. Essentially, they're looking at texts that were mishandled by non-queer historians, and they're reading them through queer eyes. An important project in Estonia was an excellent example of insurgent commemoration and memory work that can harness history to more perhaps interesting and intriguing projects that bring wider audiences. So the art project NSFW, Not Safe for Work, The Chairman's Tale, was a project created by Janis Sama in 2015 in Estonia, and it was exhibited in Venice in 2015 and then in Tallinn in 2016. It's a sophisticated example of the kind of memory work that's possible when queer theory and historical discipline work collaboratively. So the project is a synthesis of documentary fact and queer imagination. It exposes the most obscure corners of Soviet queer life to our gaze. It's a delight to see the project presented in its catalog alongside thoughtful and scholarly essays by the curator Eugene Viola and American culturolog Kevin Moss, and with a lively dialogue between an Estonian curator, Rebecca Potsam, and the Finnish PhD candidate Rika Taveti. The curators offer the critical rationales for the artistic elements of the project, while Moss and Taveti concretize and contextualize the chairman's life course in the wider flow of late Soviet history. So the chairman was the chairman of a collective farm who was arrested in 1966 for his sodomy, for his homosexual activity, and he spent just under 2 years in prison as a result. And after that, he had a long and pretty happy, I think, queer life. And what's interesting about this file, I will just pass over this briefly, sorry translators, is that he makes a lot of use of the archival file in this art project. So the archival file is 165 pages of material, which has a whole range of documents, including testimony from the chairman, testimony against him, medical testimony, and so forth. So the result is an extraordinary example of how insurgent commemoration brings conventional historical research and creative artistry together. Another interesting example of insurgent memory work are the history projects by the Belarusian organization Makeout, Belarusian LGBT activists also rely on more familiar techniques of storytelling and historical commemoration to bring queers together and to communicate with the wider world online with their history projects. So Makeout is a collective cultural initiative that screens films, offers anti-homophobia training sessions, and runs a web portal for news, events, and history. Makeout's Retra pages offer interviews with earlier generations of LGBT activists recalling Minsk Pride parades in the 1990s, a story about how the Belarusian mainstream press dealt with LGBT teens' letters at the same period, and younger queers reminiscing about the balcony, a rooftop gathering space in Vitebsk, and much more. And as well, Makeout has also produced this album, which reproduces in hard copy much of the content of their website. And they produced this in a small print run because they were determined to leave a physical trace of their existence. They don't know how much longer their activism will be permitted in Belarus, but they were determined to leave something behind. And so I deposited a copy of this in Oxford's Bodleian Library, and it's gone to other places as well. Finally, of course, there was an important Ukrainian project that used insurgent and conventional techniques, and this was Carlos Mota's 2015 project, Patriots, Citizens, and Lovers, at the Pinchuk Arts Center here in Kiev. So this used interview material and also conventional historical investigation to produce a chronology of the history of Ukrainian repression of homosexuality, and also to present the stories of contemporary activists and queer community members. So here history is mobilized to speak directly to the viewer through a variety of media using interviews, classical historical research, and the artist's visionary reading of the situation for queers in a context far from his own American home turf. The result is a series of chronicles that document the oppression experienced by LGBT Ukrainians in the present, tethered to a chronicle of homosexual repression in the distant and recent past in the region. So here we are coming to the conclusion. I've argued that history has a lot to contribute to the struggle for LGBT citizenship in the post-Soviet world. Whatever the queer theory critics say about the dangers of relying on conventional history to write the queer past, and some of those dangers are real, I still believe that our history matters. It matters more than ever in a world where the information regime about homosexuality and queer genders is changing as rapidly as the technologies that filter, select, and deliver information to our phones and screens. We live in the Google information age, the Google information regime. When I was a teenager coming to terms with my homosexuality in 1975 in Canada, a heteronormative information regime was beginning to fall apart. But the ways of providing information continued to reflect the politics of who governed libraries, archives, and electronic media. Representations of queer lives barely existed on broadcast television or radio, and the newspapers were very careful about how they discussed the question. The information regime that governs our knowledge access is incredibly fragmented now. And as Emil Edenborg has recently argued, it's not the access to information that matters so much now, as how it is framed and presented to us. Knowing where we came from, what kinds of challenges we faced, and how we overcame them is more critical than ever. And giving these stories the attention they deserve depends on our willingness to make them exciting and to communicate them to the wider world, and especially to future generations of LGBT citizens. I've also argued that the post-Soviet world can use its queer past not only in local and national conversations about queer citizenship, but also on a global stage to challenge the current domination of Western ways of thinking about the experience of LGBT people in the past. It is impertinent, indeed, it is painful to be a Western scholar from the world's most privileged university telling you what I think about your past and the way that you might use that past. For a long time, as a researcher, I felt fairly lonely as someone curious about a subject nobody in the academic world wanted to think about. Now there is a critical mass of young people doing this research inside and outside academic life, inside and outside the region, and I am looking forward to giving the floor over to a younger generation of Latvians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Georgians, Russians, and all the rest. Kyrgyz people too. I think the future belongs to you, the LGBT people in the countries of the former Soviet Union and the former socialist bloc, who will write your own histories and who will tell your own stories in your own way. The stories you have to tell and your struggles will shape the way that the next generation understands the queer predicament in the post-Soviet and post-socialist world. In the process of developing that understanding, you will make new contributions to queer theory and queer studies. And I think those new insights will ultimately help to unsettle the current domination of Western ways of thinking about LGBT history and LGBT experience. Thank you very much. Дякую.
Раз. У нас есть еще один микрофон. Если у вас есть вопросы, пожалуйста, поднимайте руку. Их можно задать. Что, ни у кого нет вопросов? Вопросы можно задавать по-русски и будут переводить.
You've mentioned that there was a trial in Estonia, presumably Soviet Estonia, and the person was persecuted. Can you please just tell the range of how many people were persecuted and put to prison in Soviet era, in Soviet countries? Just the range.
The range is, we can document about 35,000 cases of arrests that we found in the central archives in Moscow, and also triangulating that information with information from local archives, from the capitals of each of the respective republics that we've had access to. So, in particular, Vladimir Volodin, in his book Queer History of Belarus, has a good table that shows the number of arrests. And here, of course, we're talking about arrests for male homosexuality under the law that was enacted by Stalin in 1933 and then decriminalized at different times in the former Soviet republics. So Ukraine was the first to decriminalize in December 1991, and others haven't yet been decriminalized. So the minimum is 35,000, but I would guesstimate that it's more like 60 or 70,000 altogether.
Thank you very much for coming here and delivering this lecture. We were speaking a lot about the history of persecution and homophobia, and my question maybe it would be a bit broad, but I would like to ask what differences in the discourse of homophobia you can find in the West and in the East. Thank you.
It's a huge question. I just published a book in English called Russian Homophobia, From Stalin to Sochi. It's in English, unfortunately, only at this point, but it is available as an ebook if you go to Bloomsbury Academic website. So in that book, what I tried to do was, I was very struck in 2013 by the Western reaction to the gay propaganda law discussion in Russia itself. And that discussion in Western social media was pretty ignorant of Russian history and of the things that I wrote about in my first book about Russian and Soviet homosexuality. So I thought it was time for a restatement that looked specifically at homophobia. What's different? There has been, in parts of the West, there has been a different history, a different and longer history of activism, attacking homophobia, questioning homophobia, developing techniques of activism and developing, if you like, community partners, allies outside of the LGBT community who also now understand the danger of homophobia and the cruelty of it. What has happened in the East, and particularly in Russia and some of the countries of the former Soviet Union, is a kind of politicization of so-called traditional relations and a politicization of a kind of official homophobia. And this is usually caught up in a wider geopolitical struggle between two forms of politics. I'm probably telling you everything you already know about your own political situations in your home countries, but the idea that a pro-Russian party supports traditional family values, whereas a pro-EU party supports human rights for LGBT citizens and diversity and tolerance. So that's the situation that's developed in a very short space of time since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think that the differences are, first of all, that in the West we've had a longer time to conduct a politics against homophobia, and many people of your age, looking around the room, in the West, of that same age group, forget that. They don't realize actually how long it took and what struggles were involved in building that kind of anti-homophobic politics and finding allies and creating allies in wider society. So I think that the message is it will be a slow and long conversation with your fellow citizens to get to some space where there's a less homophobia and a more tolerant politics. It doesn't come like that.
Thank you so much for your lecture. So I have some remarks, more questions. So I really like this idea of queer archive, and I don't know if you may be familiar with the work of Evgeny Fix. So he did this project which is artistic, but it takes, it's called Postcards from Prussia, where he takes Soviet postcards from like this landmark locations, yeah, and kind of appropriates those places and writes them into the queer history. And so in Bishkek, where I'm from, we were also inspired by this because we were doing a project about Bishkek and its history, urban history, and we were designing this guided tours, yeah, by different themes. But we really wanted to do like a map and a guided tour of the queer locations in Bishkek, or some kind of commemoration. But because we couldn't find enough in archives or anywhere, we decided to create it. So we created an archive, and then it was presented as like this discovery, and so after it was presented, people found out that it was kind of a fabrication, that it wasn't real, and that really upset them. And they thought that this somehow invalidates the entire idea, and that it's not interesting because of that. But to ask the interesting question was why people thought it's not possible, yeah, that there would be this commune of queer communists who lived in Bishkek in 1970s, and they were queer, but they were also communists, and they criticized the Soviet government for how it betrayed the revolutionary potential of gender politics, sexual liberation, etc. So, what is your attitude? I guess I can frame it as a question to you know, if we cannot deal with this, you know, the archives may not be the very productive places for us to go, or the diaries may not have been preserved. How do we, yeah, is it actually legitimate to create this kind of, or do this kind of memory work as a kind of an artistic project?
Historians don't have a monopoly on memory work, is the first thing I would say. And particularly when it comes to the queer community, we can all be our own historians. And I think that the value of some of the projects I've talked about is that they have been based at least on a sort of thread of fact, like Evgeny Fix's photographs of the Plieshki in Moscow, is actually based on my first book, Homosexual Desire in Revolutionary Russia, and I actually had some photographs of these Plieshki that I myself collected, postcards, antique postcards from the periods when those people were using them. But what do we do when we don't have an archive? First of all, we remember that we need to go into the archives that we can get access to and use our queer eyes to find material that's there. Just simply despairing that there is no material there is, I think, a sad thing to do. So start with some optimism about what might be findable in the archives. I know in many countries of the former Soviet Union, particularly in Central Asia, going into archives is not an option or is not easy at all. And it also requires a certain guts and strategizing to find material on queer lives in ex-Soviet archives. You can't simply go to the archivists and say, give me everything you have on homosexuals. They'll say bye-bye very quickly. I've turned to this slide because Svetkovich talks about our creations of our own archives. And that, I think, is really important. And it doesn't necessarily have to be based on fact, but I know the work that you're doing, for example, with interviews, is that kind of archival creation. You know, if people didn't go and ask the older generation, or even younger people, people your age, what's your experience like? How have you dealt with these things? How did you talk to your parents? Have you talked to your parents? How do you compartmentalize your lives? If people don't ask those things and write them down or record them, then they're going to be forgotten, because private life is so often forgotten in the archives. The archives of the state are mostly the archives of public life, particularly in the Soviet region. And the reason for that is that the public did not trust the state to handle private material. It's much more the tradition in some Western countries for us to donate our private material to state archives, because maybe we're naive, but we trust the state to handle that effectively and sensitively. But for very good reasons, people in the Soviet region have not, generally speaking, trusted archives. So the point is to make our own archives, I think. And start with the accessible past, the people around you, the older people in your communities, and even the younger people. You can make an archive of what it's like to be an 18-year-old in Kiev today and queer. And that's a way to get started. And to leave something for yourself, for the future, a letter to yourself when you're 45, go back to it, or something that future generations will also rely on and be interested in.
Hello, thanks for a great lecture. I'm Olga, I'm a historian, and actually I was a group mate of Ira Roldugina, and I know Vladimir Volodin, and I chatted with Ira, and she's planning to come to SBU archive in autumn, and I'm really thrilled. I'm really happy that someone's gonna dig into SBU archive with the queer lenses, because it hasn't been done. And also whoever borrowed my book by Vladimir Volodin and never gave it back, please do that.
You can download your own PDF of the book.
Oh, great, so just keep it. And I've been thinking about this moment of criminalization. We all kind of know that Stalin was a very cruel person, and sometimes we don't really try to explain that much. Why was homosexuality criminalized in Soviet Union? But it doesn't, when you think about it more, it doesn't really seem like there was solid ground for that, because Soviet Union was a very strange state, but it was atheist. There was no Christian or overtly Christian ideology behind it, and Stalin's constitution was the most democratic constitution ever. It was just not really holding to the reality. And we also know there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Soviet Union, but it was never on paper. And it could never be on paper because Lenin's works it didn't comply with Lenin's works. And so I've been thinking whether Lenin had anything written on sexuality or homosexuality, and whether homosexuality and ban criminalization was discussed in party meetings, because Stalin was still just a secretary of the party. Could he just criminalize the homosexuality on his own, or was there a debate? So yeah, that's my question. Thanks.
Thank you. It's these have all been fantastic questions. I've written about this story in my first book on the history of homosexuality. So it's published in Russian as «Гомосексуальное влечение в революционной России», and it possibly is findable online. I believe people have PDF'd it and put it up online already. So I think it's in chapter 5 or chapter 6, I discuss what I knew in 2001 about these issues. And in my latest book, Russian Homophobia from Stalin to Sochi, in chapter 7, I talk about what has emerged since, what we know since that time. So to just summarize what all of that means, basically, is that Stalin, first of all, was not the originator of the law. The law came from Genrikh Yagoda, the deputy head of the secret police at that time. In mid-1933, as part of the passportization process, they began to make a note of who was homosexual as they were passportizing the cities of the Soviet Union. It appears that those lists of homosexuals were then somehow transmitted up the chain of command, and eventually at the top of the security police they decided that groups of homosexuals constituted a security problem. And also a problem in terms of their conception, their emerging conception of the socialist city. You had the idea of flourishing male prostitution alongside female prostitution in specific urban spaces, the plieshki we've talked about. And so the security police, without waiting for a law, began to arrest large groups of homosexuals. And Ira Rodulgina has written about this in an edition of the Russian journal Ab Imperio last year. She's published a little bit of information about the people who were arrested. So it's possible to look at some Russian documents that she's got from the FSB St. Petersburg archive out of that, and some of the figuranti in those early arrests. So this is before a law is actually enacted. And so eventually a letter goes from Yagoda to Stalin to propose this. Stalin, Kaganovich, and others enthusiastically approve the idea. We don't know how much discussion of the law took place. There's a file in the archives of the presidency of the Russian Federation that appears to be solely about this particular episode, but only certain pages of it have been published in 1993, and of course no one else has access to it. So we don't know the full story. And even Ira, when she went to the FSB archives in St. Petersburg to look at this particular first wave of arrests, she was denied access to certain pages in the archive. What they do is they sew up the pages in a blue envelope, and you can only look at the pages that they allow you to look at. And the pages that were hidden were the operational information. So the things that might tell us something about what the rationale for this was. It remains a big mystery. But I think it's a confluence of two things. First of all, this passportization and a vision of the socialist city as not having declassed elements, not having prostitution as an economic activity in the city. And secondly, then, the security threat that unsupervised groups of men gathering together across class, across occupational boundaries represented for the security police. Very soon after these first initial arrests, the security police begin to construct a narrative of the security dangers of homosexuals. And occasionally the state does talk about that. I've spoken a little bit about that in my first book, and also I discuss what more we know about that in my second book on homophobia. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the wonderful lecture. I have a question regarding those Western ways of talking about LGBT. You have mentioned during this lecture a few times that you have hope that a younger generation of post-Soviet scholars and activists, they will challenge these Western ways of talking about LGBT history. And to be honest, at the moment I thought that, oh, you're an optimist. And I wanted to ask you whether you don't think that this hope is a little bit premature, because predominantly, like as it looks from my perspective at least, scholars and activists from post-Soviet space, they don't challenge these ways of talking about LGBT so much, but rather they attempt to reproduce them. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's something, I've renewed my contacts with LGBT activists in the region over the last 2 or 3 years. And so what I'm hearing from a younger generation of LGBT activists, from some of the thoughtful members of these communities, is that Western ways of thinking about LGBT experience don't always fit our experience, and can be simply downloaded and will use the same software. Thank you very much. That app will do for us. So that's something I'm trying to be very sensitive about and very aware of, because otherwise it's incredibly arrogant for me to come from the West bearing knowledge and giving it to you. I think what you need to do is create your own knowledge, create your own stories, and create your own analysis of what your experience is. I did some intense work in the archives in the 1990s when I was working on my doctorate and produced that first book. And more intense work in the 2000s, based on, it's now 50 years of my queer existence and my own sort of analysis, which is it's not hegemonic, it's not from America, but it's from Canada. We were already kind of colonized sort of outpost of LGBT studies and queer thinking, and queer knowledge. Not everything fitted in Canada in 1975 that we inherited from Stonewall. So I guess what I'm saying is you have the right, you have in a sense a duty to reflect on all of these apps we're giving you and all of these ideas that we are putting before you, and deciding for yourselves whether they work for you or not, and what parts of them are relevant and what parts of them don't make sense in the current political and social and cultural situation you experience.
Mr. Hilley, would you please answer how much does the problems of sexism and lookism overlap the problem of homophobia? Thank you.
Certainly, the problem of sexism is something that is really important in the construction of homophobia. We know that almost all of Stalin's attention was paid to gay men. So where are the L, the B, the T in this story? They're submerged. They're not as visible as the story of gay men. But we also know from feminism that the suppression of male homosexuality has implications for the way that patriarchy works, creates a more toxic masculinity, a more aggressive, militaristic masculinity, and that is part of the problem of homophobia, particularly as a political problem. That analysis of how patriarchy is constructed, that's a huge sort of field of feminist studies and LGBT studies that is pretty accessible to you, I think, and we can develop that further. Lookism, I'm not so sure I can comment on, but obviously it's there with other forms of unacknowledged disadvantages that people suffer, and along with sort of class distinctions and economic opportunities or lack of economic opportunities, it constructs all kinds of hierarchies within our own communities. The trick, I think, for an emerging LGBT movement is to not to let those hierarchies destroy whatever unity you can construct in order to present a united face to the mainstream in your society. The thing is to acknowledge those differences, to struggle with those hierarchies, but actually then to speak with a united voice when you're talking to the community at large, if that's possible.
У нас есть время на 1, максимум 2 вопроса, потому что здесь сейчас будет следующее мероприятие. Нет? Okay. Thank you so much for the brilliant and enriching